Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar on carbon credits and their role in sustainable business strategy. I'm Harriet Hodgson Grove. I'm a partner at UHY Hacker Young, and I'm delighted to introduce you to this timely session, especially as it's COP30 currently underway in Brazil, bringing global attention to climate action and the future of carbon markets. Today's session is designed to give you clear and practical answers, whether you're just starting out on or refining your sustainable business strategy. At UHY, our sustainable business services are designed to help organisations embed sustainability into their core strategy. So not just as a compliance exercise, but really driving long-term value. It's all part of our commitment to helping you prosper in a rapidly evolving business landscape. We help clients prosper at every stage of their sustainability journey, from getting to grips with ESG requirements and collecting the right data, through to reporting and independent assurance. Our focus is on making sustainability practical and valuable and helping clients improve efficiency, building stakeholder trust, and then strengthening their long-term resilience. Carbon credits are increasingly becoming a key part of that journey. So whether you're aiming for net zero or carbon neutrality, but navigating this space can be complex, and that's where expert guidance is essential. So we're thrilled today to be joined by Andy Harris, Managing Director and co-founder of Nature Broking. Nature Broking is a premium natural capital intermediary, helping companies meet their climate goals in a way that they can be proud of. They specialise in the highest integrity, lowest risk carbon projects, offering diversified, de-risked portfolios tailored to each client's needs. Andy is a climate and sustainability risk expert and leads Nature Broking strategy. And in today's session, he'll unpack the fundamentals of carbon credits, the different types available, and how they can fit into a credible and effective sustainability strategy. He'll also touch on the evolving regulatory landscape and how businesses can position themselves for success. So whether you're just starting out on your net zero journey or looking to enhance your current approach, this webinar will give you the insight you need to make informed and impactful decisions. So Andy, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for the great intro and for having me. I think you actually have ruined my first slide there, Harriet. That's exactly what I was going to say. But to reiterate, so yes, with Nature Broking, we are a carbon credit, natural capital intermediary and strategic advisory firm. And just very quickly, what does that actually mean, that jargon? Well, quite frankly, we help companies purchase the right carbon credits for them that they need for their voluntary targets, and we'll touch on the involuntary target side and what that means in the future. We also are a strategic portfolio manager, so we build kind of diversified portfolios, as Harriet said, of carbon credits for all sorts of different purposes. We provide due diligence on carbon projects as a service as well. So this is for organizations that know what they're going to buy, but they want to have kind of a sense check on it. And we also engage in direct project financing at a very early stage to get some really amazing, impactful projects all around the world kind of off the ground and into the market. So what are we going to touch on today? Well, today is really about kind of giving everybody the whistle-stop tour through the carbon credit markets. So that's starting with kind of what is a credit, teaching you the very basics, but and why they matter. It's really critical. Where do they fit in? Secondly, we'll look at the drivers and the benefits. What is going on in the market at the moment that means that organizations are increasingly touching the carbon credit world, and why that's really important to their, I guess, net zero journeys and other sustainability standards. And then the final aspect is what are the different types of carbon credits? What is out there? How do I engage with them? I think what's critical from these 3 points and running through this whole narrative, particularly for those who've been watching the outcomes of COP in the last few days and the things building up to it, is that there's a lot of noise now around the move towards being proactive and inserting carbon credits as an actual part of your core sustainability strategy. No longer is it something that hangs off the edge of it. It's actually central to it. And this here is being pushed by things like the Science-Based Targets Initiative. UK government has released all sorts of legislation and regulation around this recently. And I think it's really important to start thinking about this actually as part of your core strategy. So we'll touch on that. I guess jumping into it, so the very highest level, and I'm sure that many people already know this, but for those who don't, what is a carbon credit? Well, quite simply, it is a financing mechanism to generate or do an activity that sucks carbon out the atmosphere or reduces carbon from an activity that is producing carbon. So take an example of planting trees, afforestation. The trees will, when you grow them, turn atmospheric carbon into their leaves and their trunk and their roots. And a carbon credit it accounts for 1 ton of that atmospheric carbon being sucked into the forest, and it's all measured and governed properly. A carbon credit then is produced from that project, and when it's sold to an organization, the financing from that organization goes back into the project and allows the project to continue, or in some cases to start if you bought the credit before the project started. And then the organization can use that carbon credit in order to offset against its own footprint and carbon emissions, and therefore mitigating your impact by financing the project. Now, the carbon credit is then deleted, it's recorded publicly in all good cases, and you then don't have to worry about it getting sold again or anything like that. But in essence, it is just a financing mechanism to do things that suck carbon out the atmosphere or reduce carbon emissions. A little bit of kind of level setting, then jargon busting. I think we covered the top three, mostly kind of water emissions. Probably don't need to go into that. With carbon credits and natural capital, I'm hoping people kind of are fairly aware of that. And obviously, carbon credits we touched on. The bottom three are important for this presentation, though. So the bottom left, it's really important to conceptualize this when you're looking at the carbon credit world. There are 3 types of carbon credits broadly: removals, reduction, and avoidance. And you'll probably hear these talked about quite a lot. In that order, they are typically considered quality from left to right, high quality to lower quality. Now, that is not always the case, and we'll touch on that later, but removals are an activity that actually suck greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, like planting a tree. Reductions are what they sound like. They reduce an activity that is putting carbon or GHGs into the atmosphere and reduce it down. And avoidance is something slightly more nebulous. It is an activity that essentially avoids more emissions going into the atmosphere by implementing something. So that might be ring fencing some forest for not getting cut down, for example. We'll touch on that a little bit more in depth later. Carbon neutral and beyond value chain mitigation. Well, beyond value chain mitigation, you might have heard of before, but it's a term that actually is not really going to be used anymore. It's something that is being, as of a couple of weeks ago, sort of phased out and replaced by the world of carbon. But realistically, what this means is you have, let's say, 1,000 tons of emissions as an organization, and you offset 1,000 tons of carbon using 1,000 carbon credits. That makes you carbon neutral. You are neutralizing your emissions. The beyond value chain mitigation bit is maybe you do 800 of your 1,000. You're not doing the full amounts. You're not fully carbon neutral, but you're having impact anyway. But BVCM as a term is probably getting phased out slightly. And net zero, and this is critical, and we'll talk about this. This is when you are reducing your emissions as an organization, and then anything you cannot get rid of, because we unfortunately live in a world where we are dependent on fossil fuels. You're using carbon offsets in order to then neutralize that final bit, and that makes you truly net zero. And that's what the world is, and organizations are driving towards. And we'll talk about this in quite a lot of depth. So, what do carbon credits do? Well, quite simply, when you look at kind of the 2 or 3 major facets of what we're trying to do when we fighting climate change and nature loss, we're looking at adaptation, flood management, and things like that. Mitigation, which is trying to slow down and stop climate change. And actually the final one, which is undo, which is really important, because we can't forget that climate change isn't something that is going to happen and that is coming. It is here, and it has been here for quite a while. There is already an excess of GHGs in the atmosphere, and carbon credits help to undo that by sucking carbon out of the atmosphere that shouldn't be there. And really, carbon credits sit more broadly on the right-hand side here. So they're about undoing damage that's been done, and they're about mitigating against further damage that is continuously being done. But they do also have a lot of co-benefits. So they have a lot of co-benefits for nature, for society, for communities, if you pick the right ones. And those can often be adaptation co-benefits. If you plant mangrove forests, for example, they will suck a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere, but also they're a natural flood defense, and that's really important in our adaptation towards rising sea levels. So they do touch everything, but it's really mostly about those 2 right ones. Where does it fit in? And this is really critical. And again, there's been a lot of noise around this over the last week, which is really important, and some really positive steps towards this. You as an organization, your clients, everybody should be reducing your emissions as much as possible. We at Nature Broking are. It's absolutely fundamental to the fight against climate change. You measure them, you reduce them, you report on that, and that is a lovely virtuous cycle that you should be going through every year. And I'm sure lots of people here are doing that the whole time. However, carbon credits then come in once you've measured in order to support this journey, but not to replace it. Reducing is critical and the first step, and that's something that we're adamant on at Nature Broking. But carbon offsetting comes for the residual emissions that you can't get rid of either today or in the future, in order to mitigate that remaining impact that you're still having on the climate and the environment more broadly. So what does that practically look like? Sorry to bombard everyone with a graph. I hope it's not too much. This one is fairly simple. But you as an organization, you are on that red line. If you have any kind of decarbonisation plan, maybe you have a full net zero plan, maybe you have a science-based targets initiative aligned one, or sort of gold standard of net zero plans, you are reducing down across that red line. Now, on the way to your net zero year, you may look to mitigate some of the ongoing impact that you're having. So that would be potentially becoming carbon neutral by offsetting those white lines that you can see in the middle, going down, the white arrows going down, all the way to a neutral impact, or BBCM, apologies for the old phrase, but that as of last week is sort of getting phased out. You might do some of that arrow, and you might just choose to mitigate some of it. Perhaps it's just your scope 1 and 2 emissions, or just your scope 1 emissions. Then once you reach your net zero year, in order to be net zero, when you've reached a plateau of as much of reduction as you can possibly achieve as an organization, you then need to be using carbon credits in order to actually get rid of the rest of your impact on an ongoing basis, on an annual basis, in order to actually truly be net zero. Now, this graph is very important. It encapsulates hopefully where everybody who is on doing any kind of sustainability journey is at. What's really important to say, I think now, we'll touch on this in sort of a bit about regulation later, is that as of last week, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, as I say, the gold standard of net zero organizations, has released its kind of draft, I would say, final version of what it thinks about carbon credits within this graph and this world. And it has essentially said this: every company to reach net zero will need to use carbon credits. It's just a simple fact. You need to be thinking ahead of time now and being a bit more proactive about those residual emissions from your net zero year, and saying, these are the carbon credits we intend to use. This is how we intend to use them in order to achieve net zero and achieve the targets we've set with SBTI. And this is a move that's being made more generally throughout the entire industry, and that harks back to this message that this is now a strategy that you need to be proactive about. You need to be embedding it now and thinking about it now. So drivers and benefits. What are we looking at? So there are a whole number and range of different things here why you would be engaging with carbon credits. We've talked about your impact in your net zero journey and why you would need to be doing that. Regulation is critical, and we just touched on that a little bit with SBTI, but there's lots of new regulations coming out. So for example, the UK government has announced by 2029 the voluntary carbon market, which is what we're talking about here, will actually be to a degree included within the compliance market, and certain companies will be able to use carbon credits within that. And the EU has done the same. There's all sorts of other regulations. So there's a real push. Competitive advantage, this kind of comes in two ways. This is clients of yours that are demanding it. And we see that a lot now, whether it's you're a supplier to the NHS who requires you to have a proper net zero target with this kind of thing, anyone supplying to them, or if it's just large kind of trendsetters that are clients of yours, but also the other way around. You need to be pushing this to your suppliers as well, and essentially getting consortiums together to help them out. This is all your scope 3 emissions. So the more you can work up and down the value chain, the better competitive advantage you have. Employee satisfaction, I won't dive into that too much, but there's a huge amount of research to say that the more sustainable a company is, the more you'll attract good talent. Cost savings. Now, this is really critical because this is about that proactive piece. Carbon credits are expensive, increasingly so, and they will continue to be because of the way that the market is being more, organizations are being pushed towards them, and engaging with carbon credit strategy early and now, and purchasing, which I'll talk about in the right way later, but purchasing kind of forward and being proactive can mean that you can save a lot of time money and headaches later down the line when you're going to have to do this anyway. So getting the strategy right can yield quite a lot of cost savings. And the final one, and this is noddy for anybody here who loves a bit of accounting speak, and this is something the Nature Broking supported pioneering, and we'll be announcing a lot around this with around a particular client case study in a few weeks. But carbon credits can actually be capitalized on your balance sheet now as an asset against the liabilities of your sustainability targets. So it actually takes it away from your P&L, makes a much easier conversation with your CFO because it is something that can be capitalized. So there's some really sophisticated and cool things you can now do in order to make a great business case around this as well. Again, sorry, going straight from balance sheet to regulation, you really have to be quite a boring person like me to enjoy that journey. But I'll touch very quickly on kind of what the industry is looking like and what the drivers, the regulatory drivers are around this. And this is by no means an exhaustive list on here. We don't have time for that. So I'm just touching on some of the major ones you might have seen and heard of. So from sort of the supranational organisations, the EU is a great one to talk about. So you have CSRD and CSDDD, which are CSDDD had kind of some rollbacks, and now those rollbacks have kind of been paused. But within CSRD, there's now some new legislation around carbon offsetting and how that should be incorporated, as we sort of talked about, into people's proactive sustainability goals. Article 6 and CBAM, they're slightly important for how countries, I suppose, they account for carbon credits moving across borders for their own nationally determined contributions. But what's really important for that is they set a baseline standard for the quality of carbon credits that tend to be able to get used within countries. So it's something that we're going to see, I think, come up more of on a sort of corporate and organizational level around the types of credits that you'd be buying and why some are higher priced than others, even though they look the same, because some might have those Article 6 stamps. On a national level, and I think this is really important, as I touched on, that you have the compliance carbon market, which is a totally separate thing to what we're talking about here. Except from 2028, 29, they won't be. They will be to a degree merged, which means that if you're a company that is currently regulated under the emissions trading scheme, you will actually be using voluntary carbon credits as part of that as well. So it's good to start getting to grips with what's out there, why you should be buying them, which ones, maybe getting engaged with them now, because that's going to be really important. The EU is looking like they're doing the same. Japan has already done this, for example, and a few other countries. There's a few other things like TCFD, TNFD. I'm sure everyone's aware of that, so I won't go into that disclosure regulations. PPN02, so this is the social value procurement regulation from the government, which basically says you need to have a good net zero plan, you need to take it seriously and do it properly, and you need to positively impact the environment and biodiversity, something that carbon projects tend to do. So again, a sort of driver there. Industry, there's a whole bunch of industry stuff out there. Corsia, big one. If you're in the airline industry, then you're really using carbon credits under the Corsia framework, which is considered a very high quality benchmark for carbon projects. But there's a load of new industry ones coming out, and I won't kind of dive too deep into those. And then frameworks, and I think this is again one to slightly dwell on, which is really important. So SBTI, which is the main global framework for net zero, as I say, for the version 2 consultation they brought out last week, which is essentially their line in the sand of what they are suggesting about carbon credits, have essentially said you have to be using them from your net zero year onwards for your residual emissions. You should be using them along the way, and if you're not, you need to justify why you're not. And from 2035, every single category A company, which is essentially large and medium-sized companies, should be offsetting their emissions, even if they're not net zero. So essentially being carbon neutral. So it's a real throwing the gauntlet down into organizations saying you need to be thinking about this now. And this is, again, not exhaustive at all. So conscious of time, I kind of want to leave some room for questions, so I won't touch on the regulation too much. Let's talk about types of carbon credits. And there are a myriad type of carbon credits out there. So we've talked about the three major types on the left there: removals, reduction, avoidance, and those camps of kind of different types of quality and what you should be using. For everything we've talked about today, you really need to be in that removal and reduction camp. You should be starting to avoid avoidance a little bit. Now, there is no such thing as a bad carbon credit project. They all do good things. It's about how they work and whether they can be used for the things that we saw on the previous page, the SBTIs and so on. And if you're going to use it for anything really credible, you need to be looking at removals and reduction, and avoidance needs to be more of that sort of voluntary, what we used to call beyond value chain mitigation, the nice to have on the sides. there are so many projects out there, afforestation, regenerative agriculture. You'll see that a lot in the UK. That's really important, where you're doing regenerative practices that suck carbon into the soil and hold it there. Rewilding, biochar and enhanced rock weathering, which are sort of some quite funky processes which start quite technologically based, and then you use the outputs to spread on as fertilizer and so on. So they're kind of a blend between technologically based and nature-based solutions. And you've got some really techie solutions like direct air capture, which just look like big machines that suck carbon out of the atmosphere, look like big air conditioning units essentially, but they're doing the opposite, and they're good for the environment. And so you've got all these different things, and it's about how do you pick the right one for you? How do you know which standard to use, which crediting standard and organization, scientific methodology, type, location, and so on? There's a whole bunch out there. What we typically see is nature-based are the largest, most used type. They have huge benefits for the wider environment, biodiversity, often huge co-benefits, and actually they're very good value at the moment. They're slightly cheaper. They have a few drawbacks in the relative permanence of the carbon that's kind of stored within them versus something like direct air capture, which they essentially typically pump the carbon that's captured underground into underground reservoirs, and they're stored there for thousands of years. But then direct air capture has no real community or environmental benefits outside it. So there's a lot of different things to consider. And that's what this looks like. And this is essentially how do you know what's good? And as I say, there is no such thing as a perfect carbon credit project. There are trade-offs. And understanding those trade-offs is critical to know where you're going to use the right project and the right credit. So you might be looking at permanence as a big trade-off, as I've just talked about. One nature-based solution is less permanent than tech-based, for example. Or you might be looking at the co-benefits, the UN SDG impacts, and so on. Whoever you work with needs to be able to give you these trade-offs and this transparency, which is critical. And that will then guide you on knowing which ones to use for what you want. You may say, I want projects that are local to my operations, and your operations happen to be in the UK. Well, actually, you're probably going to be looking at regenerative agriculture because that's one of the most impactful projects you can possibly do in the UK, because it's 72% of our land is farmland, so it's really important that we transition to regenerative agriculture. But you may be, have operations in Brazil, then you're looking at more like forestry and so on. So you really need to understand that transparency and your drivers. I won't dive too much into this on price, and this is kind of a bit in depth, but typically as a rule of thumb, what you'll see is avoidance credits are the cheapest, very, very cheap. And there's a reason why, because they typically don't necessarily actually suck carbon out of the atmosphere or do anything like that. They're more of a conservation style credit. Reductions are then the second cheapest because they're reducing, they're not necessarily sucking something out the atmosphere. And then you've got all of your removal credits on from there. Typically, you look at nature-based solutions are the best value at the moment. They're typically cheaper, mostly because they are cheaper to implement. They are methodologies that are a bit longer in the tooth and more at scale, and they can be massive projects, huge forestry projects, for example. So they benefit from economies of scale. They're good value. All the way up to the right-hand side, we get the very tech-based solutions, which actually tend to be quite expensive at the moment because the technology is not scaled. They're expensive to implement. The one thing to say is price doesn't necessarily mean quality. There's trade-offs and everything in here, and actually getting unpicking underneath the skin of each project to understand why something is a price is really critical when you're investing in it. So what are the different mechanisms? How would you engage with the carbon credits? Knowing what you want, knowing kind of why you're using it, what targets and regulations you're using it for. Well, there's a few different ways we typically see the smart companies doing it and how they're doing it now. They're looking at what they have as their emissions today, and they are purchasing carbon credits that could be used today. That's for their current emissions. Typically, they're not net zero yet, but they're saying we're producing this much, we want to offset this much. The benefits of that is immediate impact. If you continue to do that every single year and not planning ahead, you are exposing yourself to price volatility, particularly price rises each year, and you've got to be slightly reactive. So it's slightly more friction because you're going to be repeating the same process each year and purchasing these carbon credits. And obviously there's supply risks as well, because there's a real move towards high quality credits. There are supply crunches expected in certain aspects. So we see a lot of clients moving to this planning ahead mode, and this is kind of where everyone's being driven to at the moment. And this is what you should be starting to think about, building proactive plans. So this is locking in carbon credits now, maybe buying 5 years at a time or 10 years at a time, or buying perhaps for your net zero year onwards, let's say 2030 onwards, and getting them delivered from 2030. But you're buying them and locking them in now with forward contracts. This hedges against price rises, locks in supply, and allows you to really partner with 1 or 2 or 10 or however many projects for the long term and getting to know them and engaging with them, which is fantastic. It's very cost effective because you're locking in at today's price, which is really important. There's a bit more complexity to it, so there's a trade-off as well there, and you need to have a bit more rigorous planning and thinking around it. And the final thing is portfolios. I mentioned not just buying one project, but actually looking at diversification. This is just like any other asset. Diversify your risk exposure across multiple different things. Diversify your impact exposure as well is really important, so that you have the ability to have lots of impact, perhaps aligned to your office locations around the world, or aligned to different values and types of credits you want to invest in. But again, it's that risk exposure as well. You're not over embedded in one project should it not work, because sometimes occasionally, like any asset, they don't come off. And again, there's a bit of complexity and there's some minimum volume, I guess, considerations there. So I'll summarize, because I think we've got a little bit of time for questions. It's all about mitigating and undoing. You want to be doing this while you're reducing. That's absolutely critical. It's central to net zero, and increasingly so, particularly in the last couple of weeks, and the regulations and messages that have been coming out. It's fundamental, if you have a net zero journey, to be thinking about this now. Regulation is here. It's not something that is around the corner or coming as well. It is here, and people are talking about it. So getting on top of what's out there is really important. There's loads of different types. So knowing what you're talking about, I think, is very critical to make sure you're buying the right thing for the right target that's allowed. And there's loads of different ways of getting involved in it, which is really positive because it gives you that flexibility. But making sure that you're thinking about this in a smart way and a proactive way is really important. And I think that's me.
Thanks, Andy. I'll try and get a couple of questions in. I've just got one that I've thought of as we were going through. Like, what's the most interesting project you've worked with, like, to date, in terms of?
And that's fascinating. I'd say there's 2 answers to that. There's interesting from co-benefits. There's great one we work with in Brazil, which is a landfill gas project. They capture methane off biomass waste that's thrown away, and they turn that methane into bioenergy, which is really cool. But also, this project does a load of community co-benefits. So they build football stadiums or football pitches for local kids and schools and so on. So actually investing in it is way more than just sucking the carbon out off these landfill sites on methane. It's actually doing a load of co-benefits. So that's a great example of a really impactful, quite unique project.
Yeah. Oh, great. That's amazing. And it's a topical that's in Brazil as well.
That's true, yes.
We have one other question in the chat. How should we think about balancing reducing emissions with using sort of carbon offsets and credits?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a question that comes up all the time. It's really important. You should be reducing. Please reduce. Our clients, I can't think of any client we've ever worked with that's not credibly reducing, because that's the only way that we solve this crisis. But credits are no longer an afterthought. So they really need to be embedded in that plan. So you should be using carbon credits along the way to mitigate, if you can, your full current emissions that you can't get rid of, if not some. But as I keep banging on, you now have to really think about, what am I doing from net zero? Because I have to offset those residual emissions as well. And buying ahead of time and that kind of thing is the smart way of doing it. So I think it used to be more of a side thought. Now it's, please do it alongside reducing.
Okay, very good. I've got another question. How can you stack types of credits within projects? So I guess using a portfolio.
I think, yeah, that's a very particular question around when you set up a project. So typically there are ways you can do it. So I think you're talking about things like biodiversity credits and carbon credits stacked into one. Now, there is talk of doing that. I would say that you can be very careful when you do that, because you don't want to be double counting the impact. You don't want to be saying, I'm selling this aspect of carbon to one company and this aspect of biodiversity uplift to another company, when actually the carbon credit sale would have done both. So we be very careful about, I don't, for example, Nature Broking doesn't work with any stacked credits like that. We typically work with ones that are that do both and have high impact co-benefits from the carbon.
Okay, thank you. We have another question, but I think we need to wrap up. So we'll send any questions over that come through, Andy. But thank you very much for joining us today. We hope everyone enjoyed the session and found it valuable. And just remember that the first step of towards a credible sustainability strategy is measuring your carbon footprint, that first step, the measuring. So please do speak to your UHY advisor to get started. And we can also put you in touch with Andy when you get to the point of trying to reduce those using carbon credits. So thank you very much, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks very much, everyone. Cheers.